All righty, here we are today, and again, it's your daily dose of Paul Zeise, and we will talk a lot about the Steelers today. Also, talk a little bit about the college landscape locally and what Pitt and Penn State need to do in order to bounce back. However, before we get started, of course, the game is always on at Archie's on Carson Street, Pittsburgh's best place for food, drinks, and sports. Open to Sundays for the game, 12 to 2. Be sure to check their daily drink specials and stop in for 80-cent wing nights Monday through Thursday. Tell them Paul Zeise sent you. We are into Thursday. Obviously, the Steelers have a big game going on. Sunday, they play Washington, and of course, the Commanders are 7-2. They are one of the better teams in the NFC. But as I've said several times, I don't know how good they actually are. I think that's the biggest thing with Washington. I'm going to be interested to see how this game goes on, just from the standpoint of I look at Washington and I'm a lot less impressed when I look at them individually each of their weeks than when I look at their overall record. They played Tampa to start the season. Tampa is one of the better teams, obviously. They got blown out. They squeaked by the Giants. They beat the Bengals early on at a time when the Bengals were playing really poor. Of course, the Bengals haven't played much better recently, but they were playing really poor back then. They blew out the Cardinals and then the Browns. I don't know if I'm impressed by either of those, but at least they blew them out. We talk about the Steelers blowing teams out and how that is a good indicator and a good gauge of just how good they really are. Then they lost to the Ravens. And they gave the Ravens everything they could take, but they weren't able to win the game. Then they blew out Carolina, which again I'm not sure, other than to say you blew out a bad team. But the last couple of weeks, they barely survived the Bears. They needed basically a Hail Mary type play in order to beat the Bears, and then they came back and they struggled against the Giants. So yes, they're 7-2. They've won mostly the games they're supposed to win. Probably the two best teams they played, the Ravens and the Bucs, they lost to. But I really need to see a lot more from this team, just from the standpoint of I think they could be a team that is probably still a year away or two from really being a really good football team. The other thing is, for all the talk about Jaden Daniels, he has been pretty good. He's thrown for 1,900 yards and 9 touchdowns. He's also run for 459 yards. But I think if you really look at each one of his games individually, it's probably a lot less impressive than you look at all of his numbers really put together for the season, because I think some of those numbers were racked up when they were blowing somebody out. So I feel like if you look at it from that standpoint, Washington is a very, very, very beatable team for the Steelers, and I think that honestly, I have to see more from them to even think about how good they actually can be. When we look at the fact that the Steelers are in the race in the AFC North right now, in fact, they're in first place in the AFC North, you ask yourself what it's going to take for them to win the division. Well, in order to do that, you kind of look at the Ravens, and I look at the Ravens as a team that, has stubbed their toe a couple of times, but let's go through their schedule. Let's assume the Steelers are able to split with the Ravens. They go 1-1 against the Ravens, so both teams are going to get one more win and one more loss. So then you go for the Ravens. This week they're at home against the Bengals. That should be a game that they win, obviously. I don't think the Bengals are very good. They play at the Chargers. That could be an interesting game on the road. I think they'll beat the Eagles at home and the Giants at home. Then they have the Texans and the Browns. Let's say they lose, 2 of those games, and then the game to the Steelers. That puts them at 6 losses. That's 11-6. So basically, what we're talking about is 11 wins is what you need if you're going to be the Steelers and you're going to try and win. You need 11 wins if you're going to win a division. And I think that there are 11 wins left on the schedule because they do have 4 against the Browns and the Bengals, which really, really help. Again, you give them that one for the Ravens, and after that, you've got 3-1. Is that what we're going to say they go against the Browns and the Bengals? I think I'm willing to concede that they'd get one win. That they lose one of those 4 games against the Browns and the Bengals. I'm not saying it's necessarily going to happen, but that's 2 losses. That puts them at 5 losses or 4 losses, 5 if you go with the Ravens. And then, of course, they have traditionally not played very well out in Philadelphia. So they're going to have to figure out a way, I think, to beat the Eagles if they really, really want to win the division. That's just me. I'm probably giving the Ravens too much credit, and I'm probably saying that these games are obviously there's injuries and there's a lot of other things that can happen in these games, but at the end of the day, the Steelers basically really need to figure out what they need to figure out is how to win that game in Philadelphia. Everything else being equal, but that's just me. I mean, again, I don't know how many other people think that the Steelers are going to lose to the Bengals or the Browns. But what we've seen from the Browns is they can be really bad at times, but they can also be really good at times. And, if you catch Jameis Winston on one of these days where he's playing really, really well, all of a sudden what's going to happen is you've got to really decide, you've got to really figure out, can you beat him? That's the big thing. And I think that's the thing when he is really hot and he's throwing the ball all over the field and, he's throwing for touchdowns and stuff. Can you beat him? And I think that's the thing where we're at with the Steelers. And that's just basically, I think, going to be a wild card game, as is the Bengals game. Those are 2 games. There are 4 games, really. And let's not take the possibility out that they split with both of those 2 teams, because that could happen too. They could split with those 2 teams, and they could basically be in a situation where they don't win enough games to win the division. If they don't win the division, I think they're going to have a hard time, honestly, going on the road and winning in the playoffs. So to me, this Washington game is important from the standpoint of, I think that they need to win it just to sort of prove who they are or what they are. I get all that, but I also get this. I don't think Washington is that good. And as a result of them not being that good, I think that the Steelers are going to win. So it really comes down to that Eagles game at the end. That's what I'm going to tell you. Right near the end there, they play the Eagles. That's what it's going to take for them to win. And I feel like, if they can win that game, they have a good chance of actually going out and winning the division. And winning the division, to me, changes the math on a whole lot of things, just because the math on a whole lot of things is if you win the division, you stay home. If you stay home, you have an easier road to the playoffs. And you have an easier road to get to the next round or 2. And you might actually be able to avoid some of the better teams as well, because depending on what happens, the nightmare scenario that would be is if they won the division and were like the 3 seed or the 4 seed and they had to play the Ravens in the first round. That could be a nightmare scenario. But let's not get ahead of ourselves with that. Let's just try and figure out what it is that the Steelers need to do. And I think the biggest thing to me is win that game against the Eagles, and they probably are going to be able to win the division. Because I have them probably going 4-2 in the division. Some people think they're going to go 5-1. I just feel like they're going to lose one of the 4 games against the Browns and the Bengals is going to go bad. And we've seen it before. I mean, how many times have we seen it before where one of those teams has no business really even beating the Steelers and they end up winning the game? Well, I think the big thing is if Joe Burrow is on, if Jameis Winston's on, those games can be really, really difficult. But I think the other part of it is if you get to a point now where you have those 4 games lined up and you play 3 of them and win 3 of the 4, you really put yourself in a pretty good spot. And I think that's realistically probably the best case scenario is you win 3 of those 4, and then you win 1 out of the 2 against the Ravens, which I think they will do. I do. And I feel like when you look at it that way, they have not been able to win in Philadelphia in a long, long time. And it's just one of those things where they're going to have to figure out a way to do it. It's not easy to it's not, here we go with my glasses again. It's not easy to win in Philadelphia. And, the Eagles have been a weird matchup thing with the Steelers, And so the other way to look at it is if they've beaten the Giants, who are the worst team in that division. They got beat by the Cowboys, who probably shouldn't have lost that game. So, I think the Commanders and the Giants, or the Commanders and the Eagles, are probably the 2 best teams in that division. But I don't know how good that division really is. I don't know how good they really are. And I think that's where, you kind of just have to, this weekend will be interesting. And that's why it's intriguing to me. I mean, if you look at Washington, and I think the other thing about it is I kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into the Commanders, into their stats. And their team statistics are interesting to me because if you look at what their offense is ranked, they're the third best offense in total yards. And even more importantly, they are the 3rd highest scoring offense. The question is, 2 games basically, or the 2 games that we're talking about are the ones that probably are, skewing those numbers a little bit because they went crazy in 2 games, and then they had a couple other games where they weren't quite as good. But defensively, they are, what did I figure out, 15th or 15th, I think. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14th. They're 14th in yards allowed. And in points per game, they are, in giving up points per game, they're giving up 21 points a game. For, comparison's sake, the Steelers are giving up 14 points a game. So the Commanders, it looks like you can basically throw the ball against them reasonably well. And even, in the run game, you can run against them with a little bit of success as well. Not quite as much as passing. I mean, their pass defense, they're giving up 326 yards of passing offense. I'm sorry. They're giving up 183 yards of passing offense and 143 yards of rushing offense. So, I think the Steelers can move the ball against them. The Steelers clearly can score against them. I mean, they're giving up more than 3 touchdowns a game. It's a defense that can be had. It's an offense that is scoring a lot, but I just don't know how much the 2 games that they played where they scored a bunch and had a bunch of yardage and everything, and Jaden Daniels went crazy and everybody was, basically ready to anoint him as the savior. I don't know how much that has skewed what they're doing. So the Commanders, to me, if you look at it, it's a good matchup for the Steelers. I think the Steelers, coming off of a week where they were resting, they're healthy. I think Mike Tomlin has some ridiculous record coming off of a bye. I don't know. I feel like this is a game that we shouldn't sit here and say, well, I think the Steelers can win. It's a game they should probably be expected to win. And I think that, even on the road, it's a game they should be expected to win. Washington is a 2.5-point favorite, which I don't understand, but if you think about it, it's on the road. In general, what do you get for a road game? 3 points, essentially. So they're basically saying this is a pick'em game. But I don't know. 2.5 points to me. I think this is a game that the Steelers probably should be really favored to win. And by the way, John brings up a really good point. You got Zach Frazier, Ciamolo back. Now you've got your offensive line basically back. And now it comes down to Broderick Jones, right? If Broderick Jones can play and get it done, and he becomes the player they thought he was when they drafted him, the offensive line goes from here and starts taking off. Because again, I agree. If you get you have Ciamalo and Daniels and Frazier in the interior part of your line, and listen, Dan Moore takes a lot of heat. There's a lot of what I would call criticism of Dan Moore, but I also say I think he is basically that guy that nobody ever really appreciates. Nobody appreciates him, but he deserves more than he gets because he's been pretty steadily getting a little bit better and a little bit better. And there's a number of games where Dan Moore, we don't even say his name. There's a number of games where we look at Dan Moore and we basically say he's a guy who does the job. You know, I don't know if he's all pro. I don't know if any of that stuff is valid, but I do know this. He's a guy who generally he does his job. So even though he, is the guy that we all want to put Broderick Jones there, and when Troy Fontenot comes back, those are your first round picks. But guess what? If they can't beat out Dan Moore, or the team isn't better without Dan Moore, then I'm not sure what we're talking about here. I'm not sure why we have to, move on from him, to be honest. I think it's just a really, really, to me, a narrative-driven thing where we've decided that Dan Moore is no good. And as a result of deciding that he's no good, we've gone out and we've basically created this idea that they got to get rid of him if they're going to get better. To me, Broderick Jones is the weak link on the offensive line. To me, Broderick Jones, if you look at him, he gets penalties that he shouldn't get. He's a guy who basically, in many, many ways, I think he's a guy who probably is not 100% healthy. I'm going to, give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt. He had the shoulder thing and the elbow thing, and he's had some injury stuff going on. So I'm going to give him a little bit of the benefit of the doubt, but he has got to get better if this team is really going to take off. I mean, it's to the point now where that's probably the only question left with this offense is Broderick Jones. You got your offensive line healthy from the standpoint of Ciamalo and Zach Frazier. You've got James Daniels still. I mean, you've got an offensive line that's pretty healthy. But it's got to figure out now. You've got to figure out, okay, what is Broderick Jones going to actually bring to the table? And is he going to get better? Is he going to get better and better and better and better? And so that's just where we're at. It's going to be very, very interesting. That's all I'm saying. They still have to work on the one on the one guard spot, but I think what they have now is where they're at and where they're going to be. And I just think that's the key. So I think you picked up a couple of players on Tuesday that are going to help you get better in other areas. But to me, the focus should be on the offensive line. The focus should be on, is Broderick Jones able to get the job done? Because if he isn't, I don't know what we're talking about here. I don't. I think that it's really going to be a disappointing thing if Broderick Jones doesn't ever get better. Because I don't know where you go from here when you've used so much of your capital on offensive linemen. And again, it's well known that Andy Weidel, who is sort of the Omar Khan's assistant GM or whatever his official title is, it's basically very much well known that he's a guy who really wants to build the offensive line up. Period. And so he's going to build the offensive line, and they're going to, as long as he's here, they're going to, draft offensive linemen, but you can't use, more first-round picks on the tackle spot. You just can't. It wouldn't make any sense. So I think that it is going to be interesting to see what happens with Broderick Jones, because if he doesn't pan out the way they hoped he would, then I don't know where you go from here. I really don't. I think it's going to be interesting to see where you go from here. I think that's the big thing with the Steelers in terms of what's next for them. They're at a place now where they're probably as healthy as they're going to be. I'm just pulling up the depth chart to see exactly who is not healthy and not really available. I'm looking at their offense. Their offense is what it is. I mean, Troy Fontenot, I think he's out for the year. I know they put him on IR. James Daniels, I know they put him on IR. So you basically have Mason McCormick playing with Zach Frazier and Isaac Seumalo. You're probably going to be good enough in the interior line. But this is their offense. You know, they added Mike Williams. There's no more additions for this offense. There's nobody coming back to help this offense. There's no cavalry coming. I know there's some people that, are anxious to see Roman Wilson. Obviously, that went away last week. I mean, he's probably done for the year. So this is your offense. This is who you are. And now you've got what? They've played 8 games, right? Now you've got 9 games to try and get better every single game and get to where you want to get to. So that's where we're at with this whole thing. I mean, I think we're at a place where now we're all anxious, just kind of want to see it all, what it all looks like. It started a couple of weeks ago with Russell Wilson coming in. Now we've got the chance to see what the passing game can be. You add Mike Williams, one more weapon. Hopefully they figure out and they start to build on that. But beyond that, I don't know where else you go from there, to be honest. They're not going to get any other players back. They're not going to get anybody healthy. It's just sort of how it is. And that's where, we watch and we'll watch as it unfolds. This is who they are, and this is who they're going to be for the rest of the season. There's no better place to get new windows and doors installed in your home than Pella, who can help you save energy costs year-round. Schedule a free in-home consultation with your local Pella Windows and Doors to find the right product for your home and budget. Give us a call at 866-593-1560 to discuss your project further. It's 866-593-1560 to get started planning on your new windows and doors installation with Pella Windows and Doors of Pittsburgh. Looking forward now, the 2 local college teams, Pitt and Penn State, play this weekend. Penn State is playing against Washington. They are at home. Pitt is playing against Virginia. They are at home. And so when I look at this game, these 2 teams, I've said both of them are coming off their first loss of the year. Penn State played Ohio State last week and lost. Pitt played SMU last week and lost. There's still a lot for both teams to play for, I think. But what's going to be interesting to me is that both teams probably have lost some of the, energy because they probably have played their way out of their, respective leagues championship game. And if that's the case, now you're playing for bowl games and all the other stuff. I'm not saying that's where you're at, but it's going to be interesting to see if both teams can now pick themselves back up and really find that edge again. Because really, the first 6 weeks of the season, Pitt played with a real edge. They really, I thought, were a team that looked like, boy, they know how to win games. They've got a chip on their shoulder. They came from way behind. They beat Cincinnati. They came from way behind and beat, West Virginia, I think. I think they even came from behind and beat North Carolina. I mean, I think they might have been leading that game most of the game. But the reality is they've been a team that has sort of come from behind. They've figured out a way to win games. They've played at a high level. They've played with a chip on their shoulder. Then they go to SMU and they get killed. And now, looking ahead, they've got Clemson and Louisville ahead of them, which helps. But now looking ahead, it's almost one of these things of where, do they still have that edge? Virginia stinks. So they should be able to beat Virginia. But I think that really it's going to be very, very interesting to see if they can actually beat Virginia. That's the point I'm trying to say. And then it's going to be interesting to see Penn State because Penn State still probably has a really good chance of making the playoffs. So even if they go 11-1, they're going to be fine. But again, you play with an edge. You play with a certain edge when you're trying to win a conference championship. It can go away real quickly if you don't have that edge anymore. And I think that's where we're at with both of these teams. I'm going to be interested to see what they do. I'm going to be interested to see if they come out of the gate flying high and say, look, we're going to put that loss behind us and we're going to come out and we're going to go get some. That should be interesting, really. That will be interesting to me, actually. And I think that's where we're at with Penn State. That's where we're at with Pitt. They are two teams that basically now need to find a way to bring themselves back out of it. There was discussion about Nate Yarnell playing instead of Eli Holstein. I don't know that we're there yet. And the reason I don't know that we're there yet is simple. Because I just don't believe that you give up on a freshman. You brought him here for a reason. So if you bring in Nate Yarnell now, I can understand if, the game starts on Saturday and the offense stinks again and you're not playing very well. I get all that. But my thing is, I feel like if you go there, then you probably aren't really understanding things in terms of the long term of this team. But more importantly, you look at Eli Holstein, I think the only way he gets better is by if he plays. And if he continues to play, he'll get better. He gets more reps. He gets older. He gets more experience. I think he becomes a much better player. So I would not give up on him. I would not give up on him or Pitt yet. I think Pitt is going to probably still win 10 games. I believe that in my heart. But I need to see what they look like in the first half here against Virginia. Because I'll probably have a different idea if they come out flat against Virginia and we're talking about a close, ugly game early on. I don't know that that's necessarily going to be good for anyone. And, of course, with Louisville and Clemson coming up, they have an opportunity probably to do some good things and still put themselves in a good spot, at least on the periphery of the playoff. That's what I would tell you. Penn State is fine. The thing about Penn State I think is very interesting. James Franklin takes a lot of heat for not winning the big game, quote unquote. But you know what he does do? He wins the games he's supposed to win all the time. And as long as he does that, he's going to have 11 wins and 12 wins, 10 wins. And if they get 10, 11 wins every year, even if they don't make it to the Big Ten championship game, they are going to be probably a team that's in the playoffs. And so, people can argue about James Franklin, and we always talk about big game James. I think Penn State fans and people around are a little unrealistic when it comes to Penn State because I don't believe they are Ohio State. I don't believe they're at that level. I think if you look at what their NIL money, I think if you look at some of the resources they put into football, I think if you look at even recruiting base, there's a number of things that Ohio State's administration has made it very clear winning in football, not just having a football team that sells out all the games and goes to bowl games and does all the stuff on national TV like Penn State. That's enough for Penn State, their administration. Ohio State wants to win, period. And so they put more resources into things like NIL, and they've done a lot of different other things to try and, make sure that they are among the elite in college football. And I think that's the biggest thing when you look at Penn State. I think, to be honest, Penn State and Michigan are probably a little notch below Ohio State. And I know that's not a popular thing to say, but if you look at what Ohio State does versus what those two do, it's very clear to me that Ohio State values winning a lot more than Penn State does. So, we'll see how those two teams play and match up and all that other good stuff. We'll also see how Pitt plays when they play against Louisville and Clemson coming up. Then we'll kind of have an idea of what the ACC is all about. So to me, thank you all for joining me. Hopefully you all have a good night, and we will talk again.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.